All right, folks, welcome to the last session of the second day. We're really pleased to have Craig Rawlings joining us. Craig is professor of sociology at Duke University, and he has been doing some remarkable different kinds of data collection efforts across lots of different settings, everything from preschoolers to adults in reading rooms, our reading clubs, and so he's really a great resource for thinking carefully about what the data we collect means and how we should do it well. So. Craig, if you wouldn't mind, just the floor is yours. I think people would appreciate just a quick overview about what you think is important, and then we'll open up to questions.
Okay, well, that's great. Thanks again. Thanks for having me, for the flexibility. Good to see you all. Good to see some familiar names and faces. So really, we're kind of going back to some of the basics, thinking about getting data. Maybe I know some of you already have data and maybe are thinking about other kinds of data sources that you could collect. So had a lecture posted and then 2 chapters from my forthcoming book with Jim and Dan and Jeffrey. So hope you had a chance to look those over. Just kind of give you the sort of the bullet points, the overview, if you to refresh our memories about these things. So I think that one of the things that Jim and I really try to emphasize a lot in the book is that most of the things that people think of as data problems in networks aren't really data problems. They're theory problems. So they're theory problems in disguise. So a lot of the sort of framework for this in terms of collecting your data and thinking about your data is really to think about it in terms of some aspect of social structure that's out there that you're trying to capture, that nothing is perfect, no data collection strategy is going to get you to the unerred, reality of the social structure that's there. So there's all kinds of trade-offs involved in what you collect, what you can collect. I think the biggest trade-off is, as with all things, you have to think about the depth of the data that you can collect versus the breadth of the data that you can collect. And so for a lot of people in the health, social networks and health, the trade-off is pretty clear that people would rather have more breadth and sacrifice the depth. And so if you can, because a lot of these things are things that are happening at scale. If you really want to understand the spread of disease, having more nodes is better. Having a wider swath of the population is better, even if you don't necessarily know everybody's, detailed biography. Maybe when they caught a certain kind of disease, and maybe you have a few covariates that you think are important, their age, things like intravenous drug usage, et cetera. So you're not going to be able to have as rich a data generally in terms of the depth, but you'll have more coverage. So that's the kind of, and then there's some spaces in the middle that maybe you can have a little bit of each of those. And actually, that's the kind of space that I like to work in the most, which is data sets that have a fair amount of depth on people, because a lot of the things that I'm interested in are things about how people come to shared understandings, meanings, sort of culture. And culture is by necessity, multi-dimensional. So you need to get a certain amount of into people's heads. But you can't do that for huge groups of people. So the other advantage is that you can sometimes get a data collection strategy where you're trying to collect on multiple groups, maybe multiple medium-sized groups. So you're sort of splitting the difference between gathering data on a big population or just a very small slice, and maybe getting something on the order of a few dozen to maybe 100 small groups. In that case, you can get group level variation. So Jim made reference to some of my work looking at, for example, book clubs. So we looked at 32 different book clubs who read the same book. So we had things about the sort of the group level that we could include as covariates. I've done the same. I've worked a lot with a data set looking at 60 different communes. And so those communes or cults, some of them are cults, were like about 8 to 30 people, and we had 60 of them, and over time. So that's very good too. So I guess everything is what I guess the big framework for this is everything is a trade-off when it comes to data, and knowing sort of what kind of trade-off you're willing to make to try to get at the thing that you're trying to get at is the most important. So no data set is perfect. Defend the data you have, but if you're lucky enough to be able to be in a data gathering phase, you can really think about what is the process that I'm trying to get at, what would be the most theoretically salient way to get at that. Would it be small group questionnaires? I mean, lots of times I think that people kind of overestimate how much data they need to answer a question. So I've been interested in sort of group dynamics. I've been looking at, I went through a very painstaking multi-year effort to collect data on 4 preschool classrooms. Yes, 4 classrooms that include a whopping 8 to 10 students in each classroom. But we observed them over, and this is, we videotaped them. We installed video cameras in the classrooms. We videoed them for 10 to 15 minute slices of free playtime. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do, to get the permission and the cameras and all this. But it's like, so that was that's definitely sacrificing a lot of breadth for a lot of depth. So we know a lot about the kids. We know exactly who they're interacting with and when. So maybe, so I was thinking that's a trade-off that I'm willing to make, because I really want to see the face-to-face ongoing interactions with kids. So anyway, lots of different data sources out there. You may be able to put in a sort of network module into an existing survey, in which case you're going to be sacrificing a certain amount of complexity and completeness to the network data that you can gather. So you may have already been introduced to the ideas of egocentric network data. Anyone? Egocentric networks? Yeah, so you may be, that may be something that you're very willing to make the trade-off, because you want to have the generalizability of a survey. You can build an ego network into that, instrument into the survey existing into that. But maybe you really need to have data that's more complete, or sociocentric data, in which case, that's going to, be a little bit more involved. It may involve things like looking at face-to-face observations. It may be floating questionnaires to various groups of people. But maybe you're able to find secondary sources of data online, from scraping websites to APIs and digital archives that have traces of interactions, email networks. Probably a fair number of you in the health field, you're already dealing with sort of like records that are being kept in various sources. So translating those records into network data is a task itself. So none of this is easy. It all involves work. It's just what kind of work you have. Knowing what you have is a big part of it. And so I would say that one of the things that we cover the most is the difference between thinking about networks as being realist or being nominalist in terms of how you're approaching it. Realists basically try to get into people's heads and into their understandings of who their networks are and who they're tied with within those networks. So you kind of like let the nodes define who's in the node set, like where the network begins and ends, and also what constitutes a tie in that network. If someone says, well, I'm friends with Gabe, I'm friends with Jim, that's a realist approach, versus a nominalist approach is that the network is sort of defined, outside of the heads of the individuals involved in it. And that is, you maybe had an email data set, or you have existing records, It's so the researcher defines the boundaries and the ties in the network. And both of those things involve trade-offs. And maybe there's some way of putting those kinds of data together. So ultimately, all data sets are going to contain some error. And as we know, if you don't have some understanding of the error in a data set that you have, that data set is worthless, actually. That's not science, right? That is, if you have a measurement and you're like, and someone says, well, how accurate is that yardstick? You're like, I have no idea, right? It's like, it's not a valid measure. You might as well throw that thing out the door. It's like, so any measurement without some understanding of the error involved is worthless. And so you need to, have some understanding of, are you missing nodes in your data set? I mean, most data sets are not going to be complete networks, right? There are going to be people missing from it. But is it missing completely at random? Is what you've captured still a valid node set? Usually it is. Like I've looked at lots and lots of network data. None of it has been complete. There are some days when some of these preschoolers just didn't show up. And then unfortunately, there were days when some of the teachers decided to bring their own kids who we didn't have any sort of actual consent to videotape. So anyway, so like, wow, new nodes so suddenly showing up. So, you need to be able to have some understanding to defend your data set, whether or not things are missing, whether there's some kind of bias that's built into it. There are some ways of trying to gauge these things. I meant to include an R tutorial. I will distribute that on the website later. Our co-author Jeffrey Smith and Jim and others have done some really great work at trying to think about imputation in networks, imputing ties. Of course, if there's, so if you have ties where you have some people who maybe didn't answer the questionnaire, but they were included in the network because they were nominated by somebody else, right? I said, oh, Gabe's my friend, Jim's my friend, but Gabe and Jim didn't show up that day to have them take the questionnaire. Like, what do we do with Gabe and Jim? Do we include them in the network? Do we just impute that just because I like Gabe, that means he likes me? Are there other ways of trying to think about the level of reciprocity that might exist in a network of faculty and graduate students? So there's lots of stuff that can be done post hoc in doing it. But that's the sort of big overview of things. I would love to hear more about the kinds of data sets that you all are working with or thinking about working with, and any sort of questions that you have. There's stuff about data structures, and it's really cool to have other experts here as well that I can also try to wrangle in if I can't answer your questions. So that's it. Back to data collection.
Great, thanks for that quick overview, Craig. Appreciate it. Comments or questions or war stories or concerns about your own data collection? I'll quickly sort of kick us off, I guess, just to put us to second a point that Craig noted, is that oftentimes the network data sneak in where you don't expect it. And so, for example, the entire Prosper data set only came into existence because the original survey design had a blank page on the back of the thing that they sent to the students. And Mark Feinberg recognized that we could use that back page to put a list that says, how many friends do you have? And that's literally what it was. It was just 7 lines that said, write the name of your friend. And so it was purely happenstance that we had the opportunity to do that in the Prosper data set. And it was a really easy thing for the students to do, like just write down the name of their friends. It took us 2 years to match those names to people who were in the school. So you're going to have to do the work on one side or the other, but there are some of these opportunities present themselves in ways you don't expect.
Jim, I haven't worked with Prosper. Do you have access to the raw data as well, or do you only have access to the version of it that you matched?
You only have access to the version you matched. I suspect when the data still exists, they're in Wayne Osgood has has the big reams of paper that that they were colluded on. So I think if someone wanted to go to Penn State and do that, they could probably get them, but not easily.
How confident are you that the matching was good?
We're pretty confident, just because they're within classroom. So the matching problem is relatively small, right? Because they're within classroom networks, and these tend to be relatively small schools. And so the range of the main errors that there were clear errors, clear matches, and a middle ground. The clear errors are people named Santa Claus and Jesus as their friends, and that happened, which I guess that's no, these are within classroom, Jimmy, if I remember right. No, I'm mistaken. You're right. They're within grade. I take that back. They're within grade. But most of these are small schools, so there weren't that many classrooms. So that's a fair distinction. But and then the ones that were middle ground were people were naming the same person with different variants of the name, but that didn't occur as often as you might imagine in these settings. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question about data collection that's sort of the style that you described with the kindergartners. I don't feel like it's as, I mean, because it's difficult, I don't think it takes place as often. For obvious reasons that you described. But a question I had is, it seems like it ties really closely to a lot of sort of qualitative research, or it brings about a qualitative research mindset. And one of the big things in qualitative research that I've recently learned about is sort of this idea of saturation. And so you brought this up, like, how much is enough data? So when you're using your survey data, you don't know if it's all going to be useful. You're kind of just trying to figure out what the mistakes are and use all of it because why not? It's there. But in your case, you could just stop recording the kids one day. Like you could, do you have that in the back of your mind that like, hey, I've been recording for long enough and I already had some questions in mind and this is enough to answer that question. Does that work in practice? Or are you kind of signed up for a certain amount of time and you've got to gather it no matter what? And that's what we should be thinking about.
It's such a good question, Gabe. I mean, I think that this is something that I didn't really cover. I think that we do talk about it in the book. I think just in general, yeah, the idea of saturation is a really good one, right? That certainly when you're dealing with certain kinds of snowball sampling techniques, right? I mean, this is something that's probably, Jim, are you guys talking about, is there any special lecture about doing that kind of like network sampling?
No, we didn't do a repeat of any of the RDS or network sampling memory tools this year, but they're recording from prior years on the webpage if people are interested. Yeah,
so this is stuff that's really good, especially in health research, right? I mean, I think that that's the kind of, in many ways, the sort of gold standard of doing sort of what you're saying, Gabe, is actually, that there's a certain kind of way of getting the snowball going until you're starting to find a certain level of saturation that people, so that's a kind of realist approach where you start with a certain, sample of nodes and they start to nominate more nodes. And then at a certain point, you're going, a few steps out. And at some point you're starting to get a little bit of the sort of like, peeling off at the edges, right? And you're starting to then see that, okay, well, this is a reasonable place to stop for that kind of process, right? So I think that a snowball sort of sampling for networks is a really, and there's a whole literature about that. I tend to be not in that world. Like I said, I do a lot more thinking about things, sort of setting out strategically. Okay, I need so many classrooms, right? I need so many book clubs. I need so many, high schools, something like that. Jim, maybe you could speak a little bit to the history of ad health and how this, for example, there's a kind of way of going at sampling at a kind of a multi-level sampling of like schools and then classrooms and things like that?
My sense is the general answer is that most of us collect data until we run out of money, money or time. I mean, I think that's the general constraint. In Ad Health, the goal was to have national representation within the budget, and so it was those are the main trade-offs. In order to get there, they ended up doing this stratified clustered sample design, and then we could have gotten a much smaller sample and had the power necessary to do general linear model kind of things. But we also wanted to do networks, and that required you to have the notion of social context, that required you to have a population within each school. And so the reason that there's 90,000 students in the first wave of the in-school survey is not because you need $90,000 to get a clean, or 90,000 observations to get a clean estimate of, a regression coefficient, but because in order to get a nationally representative sample of schools as your fundamental unit is going to generate 90,000 kids. And so that's where it ended up. Then you add to that a bunch of, the whole story of Ad Health is a resource story. It's a story of how you pay for this. And you pay for it by recognizing that, the National Hispanic Council wants to survey a bunch of people from Cuba. So let's make sure we have a Cuban oversample. Let's make sure we have a sample of twins. And so it's like you get you piece together all these different pieces of data collection along with the core data set, and that's how you kludge together enough money to pay for this thing.
Yeah, so I just think once again, in a perfect world, we could have, the depth and the breadth, right? We could know what this person ate for breakfast, and we would have 1 million nodes, and we'd know who their friends and family. We'd have all of that data, right? But we can't. We're getting better at being able to, we couldn't even analyze such richness in the past, store it, so now we've gotten to the point where we could conceptually do these sorts of things. But, again, money, time, exhausting your respondents, right? And like making them answer hundreds of questions. So again, most things that, even given a lack of constraint on a lot of this, you have to impose your own in terms of what you can do in the context of the exigencies of publishing and writing. And so I would say that I feel like I have it, I guess nobody has it easy, but I feel like for me, a lot of like what you said, Gabe, is like a lot of my interests are actually qualitative, or I share with qualitative scholars. I'm like, oh, wow, like symbolic interactionists are really interested in how people come together in small groups and socially construct reality together, right? And there's just this whole literature of people who've done ethnographic studies, of people who've joined gangs or who've got an MFA in creative writing or what, some sort of socialization process whereby they learned and became a new kind of person. I'm interested in those same kinds of things, except I want to have a more generalized ability than just that, right? Than just I studied this one group. So, and that means I can't study 30 or 60 groups for 2 years, or even 2 months. It's like, so I'm sacrificing a certain amount of depth to get more breadth on this in that way. So again, but I think that all of this goes back to that, and understanding what you're trying to get at in your own project is, and then what you have, maybe, for example, you don't need to have, maybe you don't even have to do a network questionnaire. So when I was a postdoc at Stanford, I was involved in a project mainly dealing with trying to think about scientists and collaboration networks and innovation, and thinking about the impact of multidisciplinary research initiatives on those processes. We didn't have to float a questionnaire to people to do that. We were able to scrape Web of Science data to get the collaboration networks. We were able to, look at publications and other sorts of affiliation data. So like, were people in the same department together? Were people on grants together? Did they co-author a grant together? So, so it may be the case that you can, you know, scale things up in a way that doesn't require even floating a true network survey. So there's lots of affiliation data out there. The trade-off there is, well, there are some publications that have 50 co-authors. Do we really think that, you know, author 27 and author 49 on a publication have as much of a tie with one another as if they were on a publication with like 4 people writing a book together? It's like, no. So you have to find ways, and there are ways to discount larger, you know, co-authorships and things like that. So again, you know,
these are all trade-offs. One thing that I would put a plug in for is that I do think that to some degree there's a sense in which network data collection, especially the hardware data collection like Craig and Alex have done with the videotaping and the coding and this kind of stuff, is many ways is the early stages of what genetic data collection was 30 years ago. And it'd be great if we could find some way to pool our resources to make these data a collective good that you know, the whole community can deal with. And so part of what our archiving project is about, to put in a shameless plug, is to try to say that, you know, the whole universe, most of us have collected lots of data and we haven't used it nearly as well as we could. And moreover, if we combine sources, we can answer questions that we don't otherwise answer by ourselves. So, so hopefully, so my answer to the when do you stop is spend as much money as you have, collect the data, and then share it in a way that makes it collective good.
On the sharing front, if anyone wants to watch thousands of hours of undergraduates doing a research project, please let me know.
I wish I could share the data that I collected on 3- and 4-year-olds, but that somehow their parents just aren't, you know.
But I bet you could, but could you share blobs of people interacting on a screen?
Yeah, I
Right.
could. Yeah.
Just exactly. So we could turn them into cartoons that look like just little circles, and then
maybe. Yeah, I like this idea. Blob them up. The blobs.
All righty, on that wonderfully note, thanks for everyone for getting a little bit punchy together here on a long day. Tomorrow is our substantive day, so we have a number of great talks that have already been recorded that are online about different ways in which networks and help been attached to each other. So hopefully some of you can join us for that, and otherwise join us tomorrow afternoon is the Network Design Lab. We have 10 fearless volunteers who have opted to share their projects that are in very early stages, oftentimes just the idea stage. And we're going to sort of like work together to see if we can help launch these projects and get them going. So hopefully we'll get to see most of you tomorrow, and some people who aren't here we'll probably see as well. So thanks again to Alex and to Craig. I think the rest of our speakers, and Dana, I think she's here. Thanks for all the work you guys did today, and we'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you, everybody. It's good to see you all.
Craig, do you want to blog?